serves as a reminder of our shared humanity and the boundless potential of intercultural exchange. So let's embrace this opportunity to explore new ideas, foster intercultural curiosity, and build bridges that transcend borders. Thank you for being a part of this journey. So tonight we have 9 amazing global scholars this evening, and we are going to begin. We've divided the evening into themes. The themes will be presented with each group, and then after the first chunk, there's going to be a question and answer session that divides the evening, and then we have the second half followed by another question and answer session. So you'll have opportunities to turn and talk to your neighbor, to share some takeaways, some questions, and then ask live questions of our scholars. At the very end, we'll wrap up with another Q&A and our final thoughts, followed by a reception, which is outside, with many globally inspired treats. So we will begin. Our first topic is language depth. I know that sounds scary, but it's fascinating. And we invite to the stage Aiden O'Brien.
Did y'all see the screen? Yes. Sweet. So, I did language depth and the Uchinanguchi language specifically. For those of you who don't know, Uchinanguchi is a native language for Okinawa, which is an island off the coast of Japan. So, the biggest thing that I want to figure out is just what is Uchinanguchi, which is what everyone is. This is easy. Cool. So, first one I want to figure out what is a dead language. So, dead language, they're not common to speak or hear. Those would be things like Latin, Greek, Aramaic. I think someone mentioned Hebrew to me. But I also consider them languages that are used for academic research purposes. Then there's an extinct language. Next one. Which is, there's no speakers, no knowledge of it. Someone will look at it and like, local scholars and have no idea what this language is about. And then there's dying languages. Dying languages are things like Uchinanguchi specifically. And then Rosa is another language that I don't know what it is. Uchinanguchi is a dying language. That's what I'm going to try and prove to you today. And then Uchinanguchi, so thank you. My big question for this project was, is Uchinanguchi a dying language, and what is being done to combat it? And then next one. So, for my project, I did a little bit of historical research and cultural research, just trying to figure out absolutely anything there is to know about Uchinanguchi, because I don't know a whole lot about it, and there isn't a whole lot on like the World Wide Web either. So I did that, and then I wanted to look at like some history stuff to try and figure out, are there certain points in history where it sort of started to die off? Next one, please. So we have the Ryukyu Islands. This is Okinawa. Okinawa specifically is known as the Ryukyu Island chain. It's the last island, it's the southernmost, it's the last island stop before Japan's mainland. So, a little bit of history on Okinawa. Okinawa was first mentioned by some Chinese emperor in the 14th century by name, but it was first mentioned in China in 605 AD. And then a couple hundred years later, Commodore Perry landed there when he was trying to break Japan isolationism, and then Japan sent an army there to try to meet him, figure things out. Long story short, Okinawa got kind of colonized by Japan. And then Japan named Okinawa. Oki meaning big, so Oki meaning big. Nawa being rope, so it's kind of a big rope. I don't know where the name came from, but it's good to know. Oh, I'm sorry, I understand that. That's right. That's what? Yes, it is. Sorry, geography is next. So, Okinawa is the southernmost island in Japan. It's the first stop for World War II. It was a big major island there for the Pacific Theater. Okinawa was known as the bloodiest battle in the Pacific Theater. The U.S., they had 12,000 deaths. Japan had 50,000 deaths in their army. And then something that isn't mentioned a lot is Okinawa had 150,000 innocent deaths. I just want to point out because it's not a lot of things you'll hear about. And then Okinawa is about 466 square miles. For reference, Japan is 145,000 square miles. Monterey County is in the county out to the Boonies, is 3,000. Just to put that into perspective. 90 square miles of Okinawa are just military land. Naha, which is on the map kind of in the southern bottom tip, is their island capital. And then from up here, about the middle of the island, if you triangle all the way around the entire island, it takes about 6 hours. Because there's no one big road that goes around the entire island. You can take surface streets, a bunch of different things. Next one, please. So, before we get going, Uchanguchi and Japanese, two very different languages. A lot of people will try to tell you that it's a dialect. From my research, it is not a dialect, it's a completely different language. I did CIEE, I took Japanese there, I got to talk to some people trying to figure out, oh, you know, someone asked me, what is it? And I was like, oh, I know this, my grandma tells me all the time. It's Gajong. The lady looked at me like I was crazy. It is really ka in Japanese, but Uchanguchi is Gajong. Gajong is definitely not a Japanese word, just because phonetically it's not possible in Japanese. So, just some words, welcome in Japanese is irashaimase, and Uchanguchi is mensore. I think I pronounced that correctly. Hello in Japanese, konnichiwa. Hello in Japanese, Okinawan, haisai, haikai. Minasan in Japanese, that's everyone. And then in Uchanguchi, gyusho, I believe it's gyusho, something along those lines. Mosquito we mentioned. And then my name is in Japanese is watashi no namae wa Aiden. And then Uchanguchi is wane do, wane, Aiden, undi, ichou. How it should be pronounced. Either way, there are some people who still speak that language and have pronounced it correctly. Next one, please. So, these were some photos I took when I was visiting Japan. I got to see the island. So, behind me, sorry. That top left corner, that is the view from my hotel, and about 2 blocks away from the ocean. It is in the middle of the island, it's Kadena, it's a couple miles from the military base, Air Force Base. You can hear the planes going by in the morning at sunrise. Bottom left, that is from the top view of the museum and Peace Memorial. They have little blocks around, each giant view, it's gorgeous. That view, though, is the suicide cliffs in Japan, which is a big deal. Next to it, those giant cliff-looking photo, that is Japan's underground cliffs. I think there's stalactite cliffs, so it's just water's been running through for probably millions of years. It's just caved out after a while. There's about 2 miles of just open stretch. It's just easy, people can walk through. And then right above that, that is the Okinawa Pokemon Center. It was just something that I thought was absolutely hilarious, and I thought it was adorable when I went and visited, because I'm all over Japan. And on the far right, that is a big deal. That is the Peace Memorial in Japan. The Peace Memorial was built after the Battle of Okinawa as a sort of way of just trying to stop violence. It's a giant creation, it's a giant Buddha. And then it's in this middle of this giant auditorium, tons of brilliant and beautiful photos all around it. And on the bottom, those rows you can see, those are all cranes. So those are traditions in Japan, we built 1,000 cranes to, I forget what it symbolizes, but it's just, they're like wishes or something, but they're just all around there. Easily coming up. Next slide, please. And so, language definition, what were my conclusions? So, Uchanguchi is a dying language. Japan enforced cultural control on Okinawa. When I was researching, I found a bunch of different things. There were things like culture controls, genocides, evolutions, transformations, and absorptions. Biggest things I saw were culture control and absorption. Culture control first, Japan came in, colonized Okinawa, essentially enforced the language, enforced the culture. Everything sort of went out. And then the next one was absorption. Absorption is when a younger generation just starts to stop using the language. So the youngest generation right now is Uchanguchi because of how little there is, like just in terms of news network, people speaking language. No one knows it. The younger generation has to learn Japanese, so they have no motivation to actually learn the language. And then at the bottom, what is actually being done to combat it? Sadly, in my opinion, not enough. Japan is having this really big, this really big movement to try and bring back the language. Hawaii did this really cool thing where they brought the native Hawaiian language and enforced it in schools, elementary schools, like how Spanish is used here in elementary schools. You're required to learn it for a few years, and then you can choose to keep learning later on. Okinawa's trying to do that with the government. I don't remember how they're actually doing with that, but they were trying to get it to actually happen. I'm not sure they did. The other thing is that not a lot of people speak entire older generation who do speak it are dying out and passing away and not passing on the generation of language, so no one just bothers to learn. There are still a bunch of people online on the internet though, and I get a couple from Instagram this week from my mom, just of different people that speak the language and trying to get me to speak it, but I mean, in the same way, I have no motivation to. But there are a lot that if you want to speak the language, you can search it online and find ways of people speaking it all over the place. So,
Thank you, Aiden. So I don't know how much people know about language death, but this is a big field in linguistic anthropology, whether it's language death, dying language, or language revitalization, which is currently a really big field. If you look at First Nations in Canada and a lot of languages there, same in Mexico, there's 68 different indigenous languages, and there's a lot of need in this field for oral history. So right now we're going to pivot to a different part of the world, to France, where we hear a case study that Rose is going to share with us. So welcome, Rose.
I just want to say thank you all so much for being here. It's wonderful to be able to share a project that we've been working on for about a year, something I'm really passionate about, and something that I hope I can share my passion with all of you. Passion is such a huge part in learning the language, and really to combat language death and to continue to preserve languages, sharing passion for learning languages is such a vital step in that. Could we go? The first slide. All right, so like Aiden, I was inspired for my project by my CIEE trip, which is a study abroad program. I studied abroad in Rennes, France for a month, 2 summers ago. And more than just teaching me French, my French teacher there was super passionate about this one Celtic language called Breton. Breton is a Celtic language, and it's native to the region of France, Brittany. And it sounds nothing at all like French. It's much more closely related to other Celtic languages. And yeah, she just shared her passion for this particular language with me, and I was really inspired to learn a bit more about it. So, like I said, Breton is native to the Brittany region of France. And when France conquered that particular region, there were several long-lasting consequences to that. There became this power dynamic between the two languages, Breton and French, and Breton was not permitted to be spoken in the school system. Native speakers of Breton were publicly humiliated and punished, beaten for using the language in the classroom. This was the case for my French teacher's great-grandfather, and hearing his stories and wanting to connect with him before he passed really inspired my French teacher to pick up the language and continue learning it, almost as a way of honoring his memory and still being able to connect with him. So that really inspired me when I came back to the States to learn more about language preservation and how this was happening across different languages, but specifically focusing on this one language, Breton. The big question is, why should we care? We all speak English, and we get by on a daily basis with just that. But there's so much value in learning a language that I think is not talked about enough, and I think that's part of the reason why we're so focused on just getting by with English or one language, and we don't think about other languages and how they can shape us. So I've been studying French for several years, almost 10 years, and my favorite quote when I was learning the language is that French is not just English in code. It's, of course when you say that, obviously, but, it's really interesting to think about that, and there's so much nuance and complexity study about. I mean, we're all required to study language here at York for several years, but there's kind of the mentality of, oh, if I memorize this vocabulary, if I learn these grammar rules, then I can put it together and, oh, I'll be fluent. Fluency is such like a deceptive word, and there's so much misunderstanding about what it is to be fluent. Fluency is about being able to use the language and communicate, and you don't need to have a full dictionary of vocabulary in your brain. You don't need to, articulate your grammar perfectly to be able to communicate properly. And I'll get into that a bit more later. But there's a lot of differences that can be expressed just in translations between languages. There's certain specificity of words, lack of certain words. There's differences in connotations between languages. Certain Eastern languages have like 30 different words for snow that we would all refer to as snow. And it's interesting to see how how language can actually help you make distinctions. I forget which language specifically, but we have a distinction, in English we have a distinction between pink and red. In other languages, there's like certain shades of colors each have specific words, and people who speak those languages are actually able to identify all of those different shades of colors that they have words for much more readily than English speakers are. That's just an example of how language specificity can actually affect how we perceive things. Unfortunately, it takes an immense amount of effort to learn a language. I'm sure all of the York students know this. I'm sure many of you do too. Incredibly difficult to learn a new language. And there's a lot that goes into it. But and that comes with several different problems with language preservation. Unfortunately, it's not enough to just store language away, keep certain written records, even oral records. You can't just put that in a box, keep it away somewhere, and say that the language is preserved. Yes, it's a good step, but there's so much that is lost when you just box away that information and store it and say that it's preservation. Negligence can be just as powerful of a destructive tool as actively working to destroy a language, like the humiliation of not being able to use it in classrooms. Negligence can be just as powerful of a tool in that way. So there are a couple different ways that we can work to preserve language, and like I mentioned, I think the most effective is sharing passion for learning language. And so I want to go to the next slide. And this video really articulates very well, in the specific case of Little, how young people today are working to preserve the language. So I'm just going to play about 2 minutes of this. It's not going to work. Okay, well, that's unfortunate. But anyways, this is, these people are talking about a Eurovision concert, which is like a Europe-wide concert, I guess is the right word, not sure. But at this Eurovision concert, this group is singing in Breton. Breton is not recognized as an official language in France. Even to this day, French is the only national language that is officially recognized. And so these young people are working to advocate for that language and spread it, and to help carry on the legacy of those people who were humiliated for speaking their native language. I thought that was really cool and a great way of spreading passion for the language. Like Aiden said, all over social media, it's becoming more popular to spread the passion for other languages.
Come
just the question I came up with. Other countries, such as Botswana, do a relatively better job of sustainably protecting their environment than countries with much bigger borders and availability of resources, such as the US and other Western countries. So yeah, that's all I need from this slide. So 2 summers ago I traveled on the hill in Spain. Last summer I traveled Botswana. Both were good trips, I like them a lot, but I did a lot of good things from them. It's something that just both as I've been interested. But one of these places has something very unique that other didn't, which is so much plastic. On the beaches in Spain, this is like one small section. There's like, you can't step without stepping in microplastics and like that. So I was just confused and that just made me ask some questions. And so I moved on, and then I was doing research for this project. I learned that the US spend $150 billion on the environment every year. And that's a lot of money. And Botswana has national GDP, which is almost $20 billion. So I was confused how Botswana seemed thinking when their national GDP is 7.5 times less than the US's spending on the environment. And so I assumed that we used it on electric cars, charging stations, all that good stuff. But as you see, a lot of these sources aren't really the best solutions. Tesla cars are great, I like them, but all the cars on the planet are equal to the amount of CO2 as all of the ships. Like 16 ships, not all the ships. And there are like 50,000 cargo ships in the ocean. So if 16 ships are the equivalent to all the cars, then why are we focusing on the cars? Like, it's the same thing with aerospace, the same thing with, and I'll bring up an invention in a second. And then the second thing that the money's going to is the second thing I'm going is the money's going to is all these projects to build electric charging stations and everything. And this is one example. 3 years ago, where $7.5 billion was sent into about every single electric charging station in the US. Zero votes. So where's the money going? Is it being lost? Is it being taken? No, it's just gone. And there's no targets for it. And so that is a little bit more research. And this is non-plastic, I don't know if there's a lot of plastic. This is in 2015. In 2024, the 350 million tons now 400 million tons. So in like 10 years, it's gone up to 50 million. And then if you have more information, this is one guy, yeah. This is something else that you wouldn't expect to be a big problem is the clothing. The annual reactants and buys 53 pairs of clothing every single year, which is 1 per week. And the problem with that is that 75% of this clothing is made out of synthetic fibers, which means that they not only are bad for your skin, they just release a bunch of chemicals which gives you a bunch of viruses and is one of the reasons for cancer. But also they don't decompose, they get like the CO2, they get a big hassle. And then, well, yeah, the ending of the clothing section. Yeah, there's just like 12,000 billion US tons in 2020 alone. Spent just going into landfills of just clothing. And clothing's light, so that's a lot of clothing. And that creates just, yeah, that, and then that's it. I'll picture it. That's all I'm saying. So that's a bunch of information about plastic. If you want to read it, you can. I actually noticed, but just a bunch of numbers to scare you. So, yeah, on a global level, we generate 400 billion tons of plastic, 42 million of which are in the US. Only 5 to 6% of this is recycled. And the interesting thing about this is in 1980, we wasted 60 tons of plastic a year as a country. Now that is 220 billion. And a study by Enrollment Director done in 1986 discovered that recycling is only a temporary solution, which means we do the problems, but the companies continue to do it because it's money. And so then it goes to other branches too, such as oil. So according to the Public Gazette, in the 1970s, ExxonMobil, a famous oil company, made projections that the impact of fossil fuels on climate change would end up the way that accurate studies have shown. And the same thing with another oil company, BP. And so they knew this information. They knew what they were going to do. And they were fined enough, like a few $billions, some of the price that they made back in a few months. So the cost of, like, everyone's freaking out, like them maybe losing a few bucks. And then Australia is cutting down, but this is just another example of where we're putting money into things and things are happening for the environment, but then nothing's actually happening. Australia is cutting down forests to build solar panel fields. And so the equation was done. The amount of the amount of CO2 that these forests would have absorbed is not only as much as the solar panels would have stopped from being produced, but they absorb more. So rather than just placing the fields in the desert, where Australia has a lot of that, they build it in the fields because the water makes a bunch of money. The desert first because the water makes a bunch of money, and so now they're just losing CO2 and everything. And there's a bunch of other information on that. I'm going to go over that because I was but my solution was that many countries, including America, put a bunch of money into the environment, but don't use resources properly or effectively, leading to negative impacts against economics and environmental health of the country. I say this because we're losing a bunch of money, and our plan is switch all of a sudden to all green solutions. But that costs the economy, and it doesn't do much because the actual problem is not being covered. Instead of focusing on container ships and plastics and planes and clothing. Clothing also produces twice as much CO2 as all of the shipping and plane industry. So we just ignore that. And so a bunch of money is being put into marketplaces, and now people are like, what do we do? And now it's just a mess. And so then we also figure out we need to make as much profit as possible by companies, such as mass production of plastic, switching from glass water bottles and reusable bags to plastic, because companies need to make money, so they do that by producing as much as possible, as fast as possible, as cheap as possible. That's what plastic is helpful. And so the system just creates unnecessary pollution and problems which will continue to worsen the economic state and well-being of the country. So, and when I'm saying this, I'm not saying get rid of plastic, because that's not going to work. And the other solution is not to just pull back all of it. The solution would be to, over time, slowly move into non-companies of focusing on what actually matters, things that cause a problem, and not just a good newspaper article. And just slowly move to a less overconsumption economy, because that's what we have, and that's why there's so much pollution. Yeah, that's about it.
Bring global local, and we're going to talk about solutions to what is happening in Monterey County with Normandy and public transport, potential politics, and local action. Welcome.
Continuing the theme of people who were inspired by their global scholar study, I kind of came up with my idea after visiting Toulouse, which is a major city in the south of France. And I noticed that public transport was a lot better, a lot easier to use, even though I did not speak French super great at the time. I was able to get places a lot faster and a lot easier. So coming back to Monterey, where I have in the past used the public transport system, MST, and continue to do so, I began to wonder what the differences were. Specifically, in what ways do good public transportation affect equity in a community? What makes good public transportation, and what does that look like in Monterey? I am the only person this year who did a combined Global Scholars and STEAM Scholars program, so I also talk a little bit later about how these two projects connect. But for the first 4 slides, I believe, I'm just talking about the work I really did for global scholars, and then I'll move towards Monterey County things specifically later with my STEM scholars. But the overall process for both projects were to first, again, this is specifically for the research, which combines my STEM scholars and global scholars project form. Examination of keywords related to public transport, basically like Anjay, sure, what other topics are oftentimes discussed alongside global, what other topics are also talked about alongside public transportation. And then after looking at what keywords pop up a lot, really delving into what those keywords are, why they pop up, how they're related, stuff like that. So research, and more research. And then I did a lot of data analysis for MST based off of the student boardings program they have. And finally, compared, brought these two together and have a conclusion that is in the paper I wrote for global scholars. So when we think about public transport, there are a lot of issues that it's related to. Political issues of activism. One of the first that comes to mind is pollution. Cars produce a lot of pollution, even if not the most. It's still something that we can measurably reduce in our day-to-day life. One car One car emits 4.6 metric tons of CO2 annually. 1 gallon of fuel emits 8.887 kilograms annually. And one bus, which has about 50 seats, and given that most cars on the road are being driven by only one person, one bus can reduce up to 50 cars off of the road. So pollution and the emission that was in the air is bad for your health. And another way that public transport relates to health is statistics such as taking the bus is up to 10 times safer per mile than driving a car due to the nature of car accidents. Car accidents are one of the top 5 leading causes of death in young people specifically in the US. Also, public transport, specifically walkable infrastructure, which is very much supported by buses, which take up a lot less space on the road, or subways, stuff like that, promote walking, which is one of the best, easiest, most accessible way to get exercise in a day. Public transport is actually one of the suggestions to reduce the American obesity epidemic as it puts activity into your day-to-day life. Next slide, please. Another question about buses is who takes buses? Who takes public transport? Oftentimes it's people who can't drive, who don't have a choice whether to drive or to take the bus. That oftentimes is people with disabilities, such as visual impairments, people who can't drive a car for reasons like having epilepsy, or who don't have legs, or who are in wheelchairs. There's a lot of reasons people can't drive that have to do with disabilities. There's also the cost of driving. Besides how expensive cars are, I'm so sorry. Besides how expensive cars are just to buy up front, they also cost between $12,000 and $15,000 annually. So they are very expensive. Both of these mean that having to take the car everywhere is not accessible to a lot of people who are genuinely disadvantaged for other reasons. Being below the poverty line or having a disability affects people's life so much already. Not being able to get from one place to another is really like the cherry on top, or the first difficult step to having an equitable society. Next slide, please. The benefits of public transport are also visible economically. These are some statistics from the American Public Transport Association, so I did not just make these up. For every $1 invested, there are $5 in economic returns. For every $1 billion invested, $1 million invested in public transportation. That supports and creates 5,000 jobs. For every $10 million in operating budget for public transport, there are $32 million in increased business sales. Having public transport nearby also increases home values significantly, I believe 10%. So again, all of this gives back to the economy. It seems like, oh, it takes so much money to invest, but investment is about making profit later. So it is beneficial all around. Next slide, please. You might be asking, okay, what makes public transport successful? Because you can't really just throw a bus on the road and expect it to do what it's supposed to. I have the title of the study in my notes, but their synthesis of the most common success factors for good public transport are coverage and frequency of bus lines, the how understandable and navigatable the public transport system is, if they're ran accountably by accountably by a public association versus by a private business, and if there is a speed advantage to taking public transport over driving yourself, and if they are safe. So that includes feeling safe physically, as in not in danger of being attacked, and it also includes cleanliness. So that's what makes a successful public transport. Now, I believe I moved into public transport in Monterey. This is where I kind of take a turn, because what I talked about before was a lot more of the global scholar stuff, but what I did for STEM scholars, MST reached out to me, that's the Monterey Salinas Transit, they reached out to York and gave a bunch of data on their student swipes program, which is basically where students at the colleges nearby, that's MPC, CSUMB, and Hartnell, as well as at a few high schools, are able to ride the bus free. And it keeps track of what location, what route these are, and I got all of that information, which was, I think, some 300,000 swipes, so a lot, and was asked to do some analysis on it. Before I get into that, I'm going to talk about the history of public transport in Monterey, because it is surprisingly fascinating. In 1874, the railroad was built that goes from Santa Cruz through Monterey. It's actually up and down the whole coastline. There's a bunch of fun history about the transfer of ownership there, but those basically stayed in operation until right about when the Fort Ord shut down, and there was a lot less reason people were traveling through. In 1891 was the first street public transport. That was horse-drawn streetcars in Pacific Road. And the day they started the operation, the 23rd president, Benjamin Harris, went on a parade from PG to the historic Del Monte Hotel. So again, really odd but fascinating fact. And then after a bunch of, again, switching ownership, specifically after California moved from privately owned to publicly managed public transport, MST came around in 1981. Before it was Monterey Transit and then Salinas Transit, and MST was born in 1981 when those two merged. It actually wasn't until 2010, so very recently, that they moved from a joint agency to the Monterey Salinas Transit District. So changes have still been happening up to recently about how that's managed, but all in all, MST has been running for about the last 50 years. Currently, today, MST has 36 routes, 906 stops, and covers 161 square miles. And very currently with the routes and stops, as in 2022, they actually made some changes to their routes. So again, changes that are quite recent. MST runs from Watsonville to Paso Robles, which I did not know. That is a very long distance. It's not just from Marina to Salinas and Marina to Monterey. It's Watsonville to Paso Robles. 92.6 of Monterey County residents are within a 15-minute walking distance of a bus stop. In 2021, MST transitioned from fossil fuels to renewable biodiesel. All of their buses run on renewable biodiesel except 5, which are battery powered. As of 2021, 5 battery powered. I believe they have more or are working on moving to more of an electric fleet. In 2022, there were 2.2 million passengers during that fiscal year. 77 of which were from low-income households, 76 of which were from historically underrepresented populations, and 20% have a disability. So you really see what I was talking about earlier about what people use the bus and why it's important to have public transport available for equity reasons. And then the next slide has kind of a very, very brief synthesis of the kind of analysis I did. So MST came to me with all of this information, and they wanted to know things like what schools are using what swipes where, what are the most active routes, what are the most active stops, what time of day are they being used, are they being used more on the weekends or during weeks themselves, and specifically for the high school pass, which run year-round, whereas the college passes were only during semesters. They wanted to know if they were used at all during the summer or if they were just during the academic year. A lot of that I'm still currently working on writing up because I'm presenting that to MST as a written report to their June board meeting. So it's not completely done yet, but I've done all the analysis, so if you have any questions, feel free to ask. But one of the brief fun facts that I will include here is the 350,983 total swipes over just 2 years. That is a ton. and then some statistics on the student enrollment to swipes ratio. So how many swipes that school had versus how many students the school has. For MPC, that's 13 to 1. For Hartnell, that's 9 to 1. And for CSUMB, that's 21 to 1. That doesn't seem like a lot, but there are at least a handful of students at each of those schools who use public transportation as their way of getting around the county. And it's very important to them, and that number can only be enlarged by enhancing Monterey's public transport by more people using it. One of the best ways to support public transport in the area is to get on the bus and use it yourself. I promise it's not that hard to navigate. You can actually Google Maps will navigate it for you. So if you just swipe to the side, so you ask Google Maps to tell you how to go in public transportation, it will tell you exactly where you have to get on and off and how much cash you have to have with you. Unless you're a student at MPC, Hartnell, or CSUMB, in which case you can get on free.
Thank you.
Do your homework on the bus, right? Anyway, so we are going to, thank you, Normandy. We're going to take a moment to have a couple minutes to turn and talk, shake out a bit, talk to someone next to you, and then ask our presenters that just presented a couple questions. And then we're going to transition to our second segment with our other global scholars. So if you want to turn and talk, we'll take maybe about 45 seconds to a minute to shake out a question, shake out your body, and then we'll invite these more scholars who just presented up to answer some of your questions. Thank you.
We are listening to some questions now. If you have a question, anyone who will scholars, please raise your hand and stand up.
Thank you, Master MC. Yes. Okay. Yes. Pass the mic over. Yes. If the global scholars who just presented could actually stand up here, that would be lovely. Thank you.
MST actually changed their routes very recently, and as I said, MST actually changed their routes very recently. I don't know for sure if they took away or added routes, but I believe they took away routes due to inactivity. Not enough people were using them for them to stay maintained and being ran. So actually that's where the call to action that I ended with is most important. The best way to ask for more routes is to use public transport, and then at board meetings or to council you can actually email the MST people and be like, hey, these are routes that we would like seeing, and if enough people express interest and use public transport, it will naturally be expanded. The US is very car-centric, specifically areas here where they're super sprawled out, like Carmel used to be a ranching area, so everything's very far away from each other. It's not what people use for public transport usually, because when we think of good public transport, we think of subways, and to do that, like, to put a subway in Monterey, you have to dig under the four-doored area, which raises all kinds of problems because most people can't even go there because of the military stuff that used to happen. Basically, long story short, yes, more routes would be great. People have to use MST for them to be able to start adding more.
So I think this has nothing to do with Okinawa, because Okinawa is very car-centric, but I did spend a lot of time in Japan, in Kyoto specifically before it. Because for me, when I was in Kyoto, I didn't drive in a single car the entire time I was there, because the public transportation system is so good there. They have a train station where this is like easily a good 75-80% of the entire city relies on those trains that runs through roughly in the middle of the city underground. It's back out on top of the ground to go farther out to Japan. And the train comes, I think, roughly every 2 to 3 minutes, and it's on time no matter what. I think it's really helpful when people do use those and do ride them. A lot of it becomes like really dependent on those big trains. I think it's really important that you do use more. Because then you get more routes, and the more you use them, because you go farther, and you just go everywhere. I just think it's really cool how Japan managed to figure that out.
Yeah, and it requires a national culture shift towards public transport.
I think we have time for one more question from this.
Alright, Aiden Rose, I'm happy to do some quick comparative analysis. Of each other's topic. So, question for you, a couple of questions for you. What are the similarities and differences between the way France and Japan are handling essentially the same topic, preservation and protection of the language, and which one, in your estimation, is doing a better job?
At least to me, France is doing better. You pretty much said plain and simple as that. Japan's culture is very different. A lot of, at least to put it plain and simply, and sound a little dark for a second, a lot of the really bad things Japan has done in history has not been acknowledged by them, or is finally starting to be acknowledged. The biggest thing that I was seeing was Nanking, or a lot of the public humiliation stuff that Rose talked about with a lot of the stuff that happened with that language did happen in Okinawa, and it was roughly the last 3 years, give or take, they finally started sending out like apologies, like, hey, we're sorry this happened about 5 generations ago, our bad. And then even still, Okinawan specifically, like, people are trying to get, like, as a national language, like, to try and, hey, let's get this together, and Japan is just kind of leaving it in a pile and forgetting about it. So I think personally, France is doing a lot better.
I might disagree. Okay, you said that, well, at least there was some sort of acknowledgement. At least there was something. France still doesn't recognize Breton as an official language and at all. And again, but did you have something to add?
I mean, this is just what I forgot to mention. I think Puton and Uchinanguchi are pretty much in the exact same boat because it's just a dirty look from my mother. This one, Uchinanguchi is also not recognized as a Japanese national language. According to most people, it's a dialect. It is known as Hogen. So I think they're really just in the exact same boat. It's just right now which one's kind of getting a little bit more recognition right now. I think it's
We'll have time to ask more questions informally with the reception, and we're going to move on now to the second group. So we have our next topic of community challenges and awareness in Monterey County, place-based education, and we're going to invite Brianna.
Hello everyone. Thank you so much for choosing to spend this lovely Tuesday evening with us. So my topic was inspired by my future aspirations to one day maybe work in the Foreign Service, and in college I'm hoping to study political science and international affairs. So naturally, for my Global Scholar topic, I wanted to pursue something that would help to reinforce my knowledge on international affairs, and also to assess how York is doing with our student and faculty's knowledge on international affairs as well. So I chose to study the Russia and Ukraine war, which, as all of you know, is a very significant global event that is occurring right now, which began in February of 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea in Ukraine. And what many do not realize, however, about this topic is that this war affects far beyond just Russia and Ukraine, and it affects all of us in our daily lives. One, it affects us economically. The entire global economy has struggled due to the Russia-Ukraine war. As they are both major commodity producers, you've probably noticed the prices of gas have gone up significantly, and in large part that is due to both Ukraine and Russia are huge suppliers of oil. And then the whole global economy has experienced slower growth and faster inflation. The USA has lowered our forecast for real GDP growth this year from 3.4% to 3%. So the entire economy is being affected by a war going on between these two countries. And additionally, the Russia-Ukraine war threatens international peace worldwide. So in order for a country to officially declare war, there are 3 requirements, and they must follow one of these requirements. So they may start a war in self-defense, when one state asks another to send troops, if the UN Security Council declares the war illegal. So those are the 3 reasons, and Russia's declaration of war on Ukraine did not follow any of these guidelines, and therefore many are concerned that if there's no consequences given to Russia, will other countries think, oh, there's no consequences, I can do the same thing? So many worry the implications of this decision. So yeah, Russia's aggressive action on annexing Crimea has broken these international laws, and although the war clearly affects all of us in our daily lives, many Americans actually don't feel that they have any responsibility or interest in learning more about about the war. So here on the left, you can see that majority of Americans are extremely or very concerned that Russia may invade other countries. So there's a concern worldwide regarding the war. However, on the right, you can see that a study was conducted that majority of U.S. Citizens believe that the U.S. should mind its own business internationally, and that we should stick to our own problems before addressing those in other countries. Next slide, please. And I found this to be very interesting. There was a study done by the Pew Research Institute that showed that 79% of Americans could recognize this man on the left as the leader of North Korea. However, only 41% of Americans can identify the issues associated with climate change that are going to affect our generation most. So my research question was asking, what is the current understanding of high school students and faculty members at York on the Russia-Ukraine war, and what can be done to increase awareness on global issues at York? Next slide, please. So in order to answer this question, I sent out 2 anonymous surveys to York faculty and to students, which asked 8 different multiple choice quiz questions regarding the Russia-Ukraine war. Next slide, please. And these questions I actually modeled off of the knowledge of my parents, who I identified as the average U.S. adult who engages with news on a daily basis. And I want to clarify that this is not the average adult in America, because not every U.S. adult in America does engage with news on a daily basis. But out of those that would look at the news every single day, that's what these questions are modeled off of. So I'll just read some of the questions that were in my quiz and the answers. Who was the president of the U.S. when Putin's Russia first invaded Ukraine? The answer was President Obama. Which region did Russia annex in 2014, leading to international condemnation? That was Crimea. The conflict in Ukraine generated interest in which 2 European countries joining NATO? That was Finland and Sweden. What key reason did Russia give for its involvement in the conflict? Protecting ethnic Russians and Russian speakers. Next slide, please. Yeah. And then several other questions, but that gives you an idea of their level of difficulty. And these were multiple choice, by the way, so I made it a little bit easier. And so these were the results I found for faculty. The average math answers correct for 5.88 out of 8. Next slide, please. And then for students, the average was 4.7 out of 8. And you can see some students scored 0, unfortunately. Some scored 8, but there was a wide variation in scores. Next slide, please. And so clearly, these results are slightly lower than I would have expected. And that demonstrates the need for an immersive global issues course at York, which would help to fill in some of these knowledge gaps and would help to educate students about the implications of these global issues, how they affect their daily lives, and that would generate interest in students to want to do something to help solve these issues. Thank you.
Now we invite Jean-Pierre. Welcome.
Good evening, everybody. Most of you know me. I believe if you don't, my name is Jean-Pierre. My parents are second over here. The title of my project is Nourishing Ourselves, the Cost and Impact of Healthy Foods. So first off, I'm just going to get into some of my main takeaways. Unhealthy snacks hold back children's development. The scarcity of affordable healthy options worsens health outcomes throughout our whole lives. Collaborative efforts in our communities, outreach, and reform within the food industry is essential to make a difference. Many snacks we eat are scientifically proven to lower our quality of life. My research question is, how can collaborative efforts address the imbalance in food access to encourage health and equity within our lives? My methodology behind my project is online research looking into news articles, FDA documents, and campaigns comparing pricing in parts of California to other parts of the world, such as France, or describing ongoing issues revolving around nutrition. My conclusion that I came to is that implementing sustainable solutions and regularly changing strategies based on feedback and results from reports is key for the best possible long-term impact for ourselves and future generations. So, some of those snacks are good, right? They're not. So, some of watch out for are high fructose corn syrup, HFCS, preservatives such as butylated hydroxytoluene, I don't know what that is, and artificial trans fats, and those are just to name a few. There's many, many more. These ingredients, if eaten in copious amounts, can lead to risks of obesity, type 2 diabetes, heart disease, and stroke, increase in blood pressure, and insulin resistance. According to research studies, the United States government's National Library of Medicine deems many of the ingredients we eat in packaged snacks and eaten foods as carcinogenic. Thank you.
Do you want to mention that you did a comparative study with France as well?
So yes, I did do some research in, like I said, with FDA documents and other documents comparing prices of food in Monterey, California, San Jose, California, to other parts of the world such as France, particularly Paris. And I noticed that many of the healthier options that we find here are much more expensive than the snacks that we could find in Safeway or other corner stores or grocery stores. So I thought that was pretty interesting that the healthier foods that are supposed to be healthier are more expensive than the foods that lessen quality of our lives.
Thank you very much. And now we will move to the last two speakers of the evening to our segment on emotional impact on perspectives. And we invite Marie Claire to the stage.
Hi everyone. I will be doing my project on emotional labor and second language acquisition. Some of you may be wondering, what is second language acquisition? And as the name suggests, it's a little fancy schmancy word to describe learning a second language. Another thing I analyzed throughout the study was stimulus appraisal, which is a theory in psychology that basically our emotions derive from our appraisal of experiences that we have. A little funny example that I kind of put to, better explain it is, imagine you're having this nice little dinner with your family, it's a whole family gathering, maybe some families that you don't typically talk to, just decided to come this one time, whether it's Thanksgiving or some other occasion. The atmosphere is lively, fun, there's a lot of food there, you guys are catching up on all the cool things. But suddenly, that one family member says something so outrageous, egregious, ridiculous, it totally disrupts the vibe of the whole evening, and now everything is ruined. You just look at that family member and you just wonder, why did they even show up? And now the whole atmosphere is all just completely off. That's my favorite. So after this encounter, if you had a negative time there, you may be less likely to want to be part of another family gathering, especially with that person. That, in a sense, is stimulus appraisal. Your appraisal of this event kind of led you to developing these sorts of emotions, such as maybe anger, maybe sadness that your whole family event was ruined. Maybe the sort of hey, I don't want to do this again kind of thing. Our appraisal of a situation causes emotional responses based on that appraisal. And emotional labor in this sense was maybe imagine in the given scenario that maybe you have to see this family member again, but you can't necessarily just act super mean towards them for no reason. You have to kind of pretend okay, that didn't really happen. It's not really appropriate for me to just start lashing out on them. I have to act really nice. Hey, how you been? It's all right, yeah. Even though you may want to leave the conversation or just never talk to that family member again, that in a sense is emotional labor, is the process of managing these feelings, even though you may want to do one thing, maybe a sort of pressure, whether it is you're getting paid to do something, which happens with a lot of jobs in customer service, where you can't really act out against difficult customers, especially if you're getting paid. You just kind of have to keep it all in and just put on this very nice, understanding attitude, even though you may not be feeling that at all. And even in how does this relate to language learning? As our wonderful global scholars such as Aiden and Rose have pointed out, language is so much more than just words and grammar. It is just a means of communication and community. There's a whole lot of knowledge that comes into learning a language. Something I learned about while in my Spanish class was this idea that with every language that dies, there's a certain amount of knowledge contained in that language that dies alongside it. And so learning a language can allow someone to acquire this new set of knowledge. And especially with processes such as translation and transcription, not talking about the biological processes in our bodies, but the process of translating these languages. Sometimes there's words in other languages that if you translate it to English, it's similar, but it's not really describing the same thing. What kind of came to mind to me was how Greek has different words to describe love, and we just say love. It's not necessarily the same thing, and it kind of applies to other languages, which is why language learning is so important. You give this whole new perspective on the world around you, using all these new words to kind of describe. Yeah, you guys get the idea. So my little methodology was I created these little sets of forms containing questions about basically the emotional experience of learning a language. And one of the questions I kind of asked was how does learning Spanish make you feel? I sent these to Spanish 3 and Spanish 4 honors and non-honors. And based on the responses of these forms, I conducted I selected a select group of individuals because it would have taken a whole lot of time given my little time frame to interview every single person from each class and extrapolate responses there. I got a certain amount of individuals who asked for further information. And in context to the second question of how you think having different teachers with different styles of learning affected overall Spanish comprehension, going into this was not really a factor that I was much thinking about when it came to affecting how a person may feel with language learning. However, based on the responses of the forms, there was a little section of the form where I was if you have anything else you wanted to add that you think this form didn't really address, go right ahead. And there were several people, I didn't include all of them, but several people had mentioned that, the way that language being taught for them at York it wasn't really working out the best for them. Some people started using Duolingo, some people thought that other teachers' learning styles were more preferable for them. A little thing here at York School is that sometimes, I know with Spanish, different teachers teach different levels of language, and some people found a negative experience from having a teacher who teaches a language one way and switching to a teacher who teaches a language a different way. So, based on those results, I found 3 main factors that I feel could contribute to having a negative stimulus appraisal. One is fear of judgment. When it comes to language learning, you're learning a new language, but some people still fear messing up, saying the wrong word, maybe mispronouncing it. Especially in this context of the question, I was asking what would make you feel afraid to talk to a native speaker? A lot of people felt fear in the fact that the native speaker would know that they're screwing up. Another thing was different teaching styles. Some people said that they felt lost and confused when they switched to one style of teaching to another. This was mostly in context to maybe teachers who taught in a more going more by vocabulary and grammatics, kind of focusing more on the mechanics of the language, going from there to a teacher who maybe focuses more on the culture or more on the holistic approaches of language. It could leave them feeling lost and confused. And then 3, virtual learning had actually been a big impact on how some students navigated language learning, because some students described how they felt disconnected, how learning based on a screen, having those interactions with people in that language through screens, it left a sort of sense of disconnection and not really it wasn't very productive for them to really feel great about learning language through that way. And I stated these as negative
yourself and think, is this emotional labor or is this something else? So some questions I kind of like propose, like, are you feeling worn out, tired, agitated from this thing? Is it something specific about this thing? Is it language learning? Is it something general? Are you feeling worn out and tired just in your daily life? Did you have a negative feeling, experience, or like association? Does it have to do with this specific thing? And are you like trying to work to hide true feelings? Are you feeling honestly so stressed, but you're putting on like a brave face, just trying to act like everything's fine, even though you know everything's not fine? And so then that kind of leads to so all of us global scholars, we kind of like first presented this thing in a more condensed form, like I think a week and a half ago, and there were some questions there that like we all kind of got from each of our thing, and I thought some of the questions were really interesting. One of the questions was asking like how to prevent emotional labor. I think emotional labor can be hard to prevent, especially since you can't really prevent the negative experiences from happening, and you especially can't really prevent your feelings that emerge from these experiences. However, I think it's important to like maybe, I don't really have the clearest answer on it. I'm going to be honest that like this study on emotional labor on students, this is like a one-of-a-kind study. There is nothing else out here that like analyzes emotional labor on a student perspective, especially just emotional labor studies in general. There's not really much of it, so I can't really give a best answer. I don't feel comfortable in that position to like, give the best solution. I think it's something that you might want to figure out. I think a lot of it may have to do with like why you may feel emotionally labored. I guess in a like specific example, not one that like applies or like is specific to me or something I personally experienced, but maybe you could be feeling emotionally labored in language learning because you have a negative experience with the teacher who is teaching the class. And in that way, something you can do about that, I guess, is maybe try to find other methods of language learning. If you really, a lot of it, as Rose pointed out, a lot of it goes down to passion. How much do you like actually want to learn about this? And sometimes emotional labor can really result from having a lack of passion in the language, which I'm going to be honest, I don't really know how to navigate that. Another question was kind of asking how can you, thank you.
Thank you so much. And perhaps an anecdote to emotional labor is our last speaker of the evening, Rachel.
So I went about it in different steps. I wanted to interview people and then change that into like short stories. And that basically comes from my interest in creative writing and wanting to write short stories in the future, like novels and stuff like that. Yeah, so first of all, there's something that I noticed is that there's a lot of bad news in headlines and breaking news and stuff. That's mainly the type of news that you remember. It's always negative. Well, sometimes it's possible, but, and also I wanted to just add a little bit something about history being like, usually it's the bad parts of history that are taught, and like hardly ever there's really good like focus on the happy parts and like culture and stuff like that. So I also wanted to talk, I found that lessons and morals can be found in like bad stories, but they can also be found in positive stories, just as much. And with positive stories, it's like more of a personal sort of connection as like the moral, and it's more memorable through enjoyment. Whereas for negative stories, it's more memorable through fear, because if you see bad news, you're like, oh no, I remember that because I don't want that to happen to me, right? I have some examples of like possible morals for like the different types. Really, they're kind of the same. They all have like a good sort of end, like, oh, this is what you should be like. So yeah. I did some research, like which is basically when people see good news, they start to feel happy. And there was this company, I don't know, organization called Mike's Heart Lemonade, where they took people and had them react to happy videos, some of them being about dogs, and that made them smile and their faces changed into happy, more uplifted sort of, reactions. And they also touched on bad news fatigue, where bad news can really stress people out if you consume too much of it. And so my methodology was interviewing people, as I said, and I asked them questions about their childhood experiences, some lessons that they learned throughout their lives, maybe current experiences that they thought had a really big impact on them. So I took their answers and created them into short stories. I have two. They're called Haystack Castle and What Matters Most. And they Haystack Castle focuses on the childhood, a happy moment in someone's childhood. And What Matters Most is a struggle that they felt that ultimately led to something good. Yes. And then I just share those. So I concluded that it's necessary to share positive stories because we don't want that bad news fatigue. We want to feel happy and see other people's unique experiences throughout their lives and just understand different people and personal stories. Yeah.
Thank you, guys. A beautiful way to end our speakers for the evening. We don't have time for the turn and talk, but we do have time for a couple of questions. And we have a global scholar alum, New York alum, visiting, Nayeli Farias. Welcome. Yeah.
So my first question is for Brianna, and I wrote it down so I didn't forget. What is the most effective strategy that can be implemented in the States to move us away from our individualistic or even narcissistic culture?
Okay, thank you for that question. Wow, let me think for a second. Okay. We can start by focusing our history on more than just ourselves. I think we're taught a lot about, I'm not going to say that because it's always true. But at least for me, I can speak personally, I've hardly ever been taught about European history. Only this year did I start learning about Asian history. I haven't learned about history from all these different parts of the world, and I think it would be a great start by including curriculum from all over the world, different types of history in our high school curriculum, and even younger, middle school, elementary school. I think that would be a good start. But I know that doesn't fully answer your question, but thank you.
Second question, and then Ms. Lau.
So my second question is for Maria Claire, and the stories you were telling reminded me of an instance I had with my grandmother. She's been in the States since she was 11. She's originally from Mexico though. And she has learned English and she speaks it fairly well, but she still has anxiety going to the doctor's office because she fears that they won't understand what she's saying. So last year she had an issue with her leg and she wanted to tell the doctor that it was swollen. So she asked me before he came in the room, how do I say that word again? And I told her she was saying swallow, it's swallow. And I said it's swollen. So the doctor came in and she was explaining to him in English and she was doing a good job. And I think she got a little bit nervous and she said my leg is swollen. So my question is, in your experience, oh sorry, I lost my place. You were talking about how there's a sort of anxiety around messing up. And I've heard of in other places speakers of different languages being excited when someone of a different culture knows even a few words. So why do you think there's a difference here in the States compared
all know that's not true. That's not the native language of the States. A lot of very ignorant people seem to think that like English is like the prime language here, that we all like need to be fully fluent in, especially like if you come from different backgrounds, which, you know, maybe English is not spoken in the house. Maybe it's harder to acquire English. There's some ignorant people that are just like, hey, you should know about this, and if you don't, go back to your country. And I think a lot of that pressure may come from like, I think connecting back to like even Rachel's thing, like we're hearing about these stories about like how native speakers, native English speakers are like, you know, thinking that like judging someone's intelligence based on how much they know of English, or like judging someone in so many different ways based on how much they know or how much their comprehension of a language is. And I think some of that like stress may be coming down to us, and we may be like projecting that onto like other speakers, that maybe like if native English speakers think this way, maybe other language speakers think this way too. And I think some of that fear, like that, you know, maybe we're going to get made fun of, maybe our intelligence is going to be criticized because we don't know it all perfectly. I think that's where a lot of that fear may stem from.
Last question for the evening, and then feel free to engage with the food with more conversation. Ms. Love, welcome.
Thank you all. I have so many questions. I'm glad you were reception after this. My question's for Rachel. As I loved hearing about like the positive effect of good news and sharing stories, and I think so much about like the importance of like gratitude as a practice and things like that. And I wonder if you have ideas for how like York School as a community can foreground like sharing good news and maybe like, you know, upping our like our gratitude practice or our like sharing positive stories. Just ideas for how we can do better with that. Yeah.
So that made me first think of the school newspaper that's like just starting up again, and I feel like that would be a good place to like implement happy stories. Maybe even at breaks, there could be just like a section where people can share like their family experience that seems to be happy or something like that.
So, thank you. Let's give a round of applause to all of you. I'd like to honor one local scholar who was not able to be here tonight, Sebastian Del Toro, because he's competing in a golf tournament. However, he will be presenting hopefully at break or in another format. So he is here in spirit. So last thing, just so you know, this has been a year of research methods. It's been more like a graduate class on delving into what is a good question. We looked at the question formation technique out of Harvard and really worked on how to ask a good question, how to find, and thank you to Ms. Sari for being a pillar in this program. We also worked on research papers through multiple iterations, and students were exposed to university level lectures. She wasn't able to come tonight, but Nikki Silva from the Kitchen Sisters at NPR came to our campus and engaged and talked about the art of storytelling. Also Netta Abinadi from Middlebury, United Nations Film Festival. So it's been a year of exposure to different ways of thinking, perspective growing, and so we thank you for being a part of this evening. Round of applause to all of you. I'm going to open up the